In my late teens and early 20s, I was heavily into heroin and various other hard drugs. I got arrested in 2009 for possession of narcotics, and I was sentenced to a mandatory rehab and probation since it was my first offense. When I left the rehab, I was forced to take urine screens twice a week as part of the conditions of my probation. I had no desire to change my ways, but since I had never been to jail, the idea scared me. I met up with this girl who I used to get high with, and she told me she knew of a smoke shop in the south part of my city that sold all sorts of legal highs. These were basically drugs sold in stores that contained chemicals that had similar highs to things like weed, coke, and even Xanax. The best part of this was that, according to her, they didn't show up on drug tests. I was sold, hook, line, and sinker. I had been working and living with my parents again after rehab, so I had a couple $100 in my wallet and no bills to pay. So we piled in her car and drove to the smoke shop. When I walked inside, there was the usual display cases of assorted pieces, and the strong smell of incense tingled my nostrils. I walked deeper into the store, and there was a woman standing behind a glass counter, like one you would see in a deli, with dozens of various multicolored bags on display. I couldn't believe it. I literally could buy legal drugs that would get me high from a store. The girl I was with had all been here before, and we began talking to the lady, discussing what all the various things she had were like. After a brief conversation, the woman showed me this bag labeled Ivory Wave. This is when I first learned about bath salts. Now here's a disclaimer for you all. Bath salts did not make a zombie. This all happened before any of this was seen in the media. It was not a well-known drug at the time, but let me just say, I did not eat anyone, I did not kill anyone, and most importantly, it did not feel like a crazy concoction of PCP mixed with acid and cocaine. Most of the time it was MDPV, which is chemically similar to things such as meth and ecstasy, so basically, it was an extremely strong stimulant. I was hooked from the first line I did. It was fucking great. It was a powerful drug and it was fairly cheap, $25 to $50 for a gram, and it was so easy to get. I did it all the time, every single day. Yeah, it had side effects like psychosis, weight loss, and extreme irritability, but it was strong and I loved it. I was back to my usual ways of hustling and stealing for cash, but I was passing my drug tests and no one could do anything about it. After about 6 months of regular use and experimenting with various brands, a friend told me that the smoke shop got a new shipment of bath salts in called V, and it was even better than any of the shit I had bought previously. There was no way I was going to pass up on this opportunity, so he came and picked me up and we drove to the smoke shop and purchased a $50 bag of V. I noticed a difference as soon as I saw the bag. It was an entirely black bag, unlike the usually colorful designs you would see on the other ones. It had no writing on it and just a red letter V printed on the front. I tore open the bag in the parking lot and removed 2 small plastic vials of white powder from the baggie. I did a huge line off a CD case in the passenger seat of my buddy's car, and almost instantly was higher than I had ever been on any bath salt or any type of stimulant in my entire life. This shit was amazing. I had never experienced anything like this. For months after that, the only bath salt I would buy was V. It was great, but the psychosis was unbearable. After using it regularly for a while, I began struggling differentiating between time of day, days of the week, and other basic things. I began to stay up for 3 to 4 days at a time, then only sleeping long enough to stay awake for another 3 to 4 days. I had hallucinations from time to time, nothing too serious though. Mostly shadowy figures in my peripheral vision, audio hallucinations of people calling out to me or sounds similar to white noise, and various other mild things. Since I had experience with a lot of drugs, it didn't seem too abnormal from doing most stimulants, although the hallucinations began to take a turn for the worse. The event I'm about to tell you about was not the only time I had a major freakout, but it was the first I can recall, and there were many others to come after this. I am a hypochondriac, and if I read too much about diseases or anything, I always end up convincing myself that I am sick or dying or have some horrible ailment. Let me just say, it is very hard to convince yourself you are not dying when you've been tweaking out for days at a time. I began to always think I was having a heart attack when I was high, or that some type of parasite was eating away at my body. The only time I didn't feel like I was dying was when I crashed after weeks of binging and would sleep for 16 plus hours, but I still couldn't stop getting high. No matter how bad I felt when I was high, I would still get this gut-wrenching feeling of desire when I would begin to come down. It was all I could think about. All I wanted was another line of V, another vial of V. I would do anything for it. As much as I hated it, I loved it even more. As you might expect, the psychosis did not improve because I did not stop getting high. This led to the first time I ever experienced a horrible freakout that I was physically incapable of talking my way out of. I had been on a binge for a while, maybe a few weeks, only sleeping for 3 to 4 hours here and there involuntarily. I just scored a bunch of V from selling all the stolen silver, and I was high as a fucking kite for my 3rd consecutive day of being awake. I was stuck reading online articles about diseases for hours when I made a terrible mistake and I began reading about parasites. I had a small mirror I used to chop lines up on my bedside table, and I was furiously scrolling through articles about parasites and becoming more and more paranoid. I picked up the mirror and snorted a fat line. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror, and I swear, I saw a small black worm slide up into my nasal cavity. No fucking way. I totally had to be way too fucking high and paranoid. I couldn't believe it. But being high on stimulants didn't allow me to rationalize what was going on in my head, and I had to find out for sure. I held the mirror closer to my nose and looked inside. Sure enough, to my horror, I could see dozens of small caterpillar-like creatures crawling around in my fucking nose. I freaked out. I had to fucking get that shit out of there. I took a paperclip and began to slowly start trying to scrape the worms out of my fucking nose, but to my dismay, every time I used the mirror to look in my nose, all I could see were these fucking worms. They were taunting me, eating me, and seemingly laughing at my futile attempts to destroy them. I had to fucking get them out. I kept trying more and more ways to get them out. Fingers, pens, toothpicks, any type of object I could possibly use as a worm killing tool, but every time I checked, the worms were still there. I began coming up with rational ways that they could have got there. Maybe my drugs came from some jungle area and there was some type of parasitic egg in the powder and they hatched in my skull, and all sorts of nonsense like that. At this point, I was losing my shit. My emotions were no longer in my control. I screamed, I cried, and I laughed. I was desperately trying to cope with my imminent doom from these parasites. My nose was bleeding profusely, and I knew at that point I only had one option: burn them out. In a fit of laughter, I took a lighter and burned the inside of my nostrils. It hurt like hell, but I didn't notice the pain. I felt relieved. I suddenly became overwhelmed with a sense of pain and pressure in my skull, and the last thing I remember is falling to the ground in a daze. I woke up in a hospital the next day with gauze in my nose and blood all over the front of my hospital gown. My father had apparently heard me fall and found me unconscious and bleeding. I had no recollection of going to the hospital, but I had apparently woken up at some point and was sobbing and desperately trying to convince the doctor to check my nose for worms. They sedated me with some type of benzo, and I had slept for about 15 hours. My bath salt use did not end here though. Since my nose was destroyed for the time being, yes, I did regain use of my nose later somehow. I began smoking bath salts at this point, much like how you would smoke meth, and I continued using bath salts on a regular basis until 2013, and there were many more horror stories to come. Shout out to Dyke.jpg for getting the boob trivia right on my meme post on my Instagram page. Congratulations, tell all your friends.